The afternoon sun hung high in the sky, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement of a quiet street in Chicago. It was one of those days where the air felt thick and warm, the kind of weather that makes everyone move a little slower than usual. Keanu Reeves walked alone, his boots scuffing lightly against the concrete. He had just finished a long shift on set, and even though the makeup artists had done their best to wipe away the grime and sweat of the character he played, he still felt heavy. His muscles ached, and his mind was tired of pretending to be someone else, even though that was his job. He wasn't wearing a suit or something expensive that would scream movie star. Instead, he was dressed in a faded, dark flannel shirt that had seen better days. The sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, exposing forearms that looked strong but weary. His jeans were old, fraying slightly at the hems, and his boots were covered in a fine layer of city dust. On his head, he wore a simple baseball cap pulled down low over his eyes. It was his shield against the world, a way to keep his face hidden while still walking freely among people. As he walked, he kept his head down. He didn't want to make eye contact with anyone who might recognize him. He loved his fans, truly he did, but right now, in this moment, he just wanted to be Keanu. Just a guy, a normal human being walking down the street without a camera in his face or someone asking for a selfie. He craved the sound of silence and the feeling of anonymity. Ahead of him, a small neon sign buzzed softly in the daylight. It read, Maggie's Kitchen. It wasn't a fancy place. It looked like a spot where time had stopped moving 20 years ago, and that was exactly what attracted him. The large glass windows were slightly streaked, but through them he could see people sitting at a counter eating and talking. It looked real, it looked honest. He stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, taking a deep breath. He patted his pockets. In his back pocket, he felt the familiar bulk of his leather wallet. It held credit cards with no limits and cash that could buy a small house. But he hesitated. A thought crossed his mind, a strange but strong urge to see the world differently. He wanted to know what it felt like to not have that safety net, just for an hour. He wanted to see how people treated him when he looked like he had nothing to offer but his presence. Leaving his wallet where it was, he reached into his front pocket. His fingers brushed against a small, crumpled wad of cash he kept for emergencies, mostly just for tips or parking meters. He pulled it out along with a handful of loose change. It wasn't a lot. It looked like the last bit of money someone might have until payday. He stared at the bills in his hand for a second, feeling the texture of the paper and the cold metal of the coins. Then, taking a breath to steady himself, he pushed the change back into his pocket and walked toward the entrance. He reached for the glass handle of the diner. The door wasn't heavy or made of old wood. It was a simple, light glass door that swung open easily with a gentle push. A small bell above the frame jingled, a bright and cheerful sound that announced his arrival. As he stepped inside, the air conditioning washed over him, cooling the sweat on his neck. The smell hit him instantly, strong coffee, frying bacon, and the sweet scent of maple syrup. It was the smell of comfort. The diner wasn't crowded. A few truckers sat in a booth by the window, laughing over plates of food. An elderly couple sat in the corner, sharing a milkshake in silence. Keanu kept his cap low and walked toward the counter. He chose a stool near the end, away from the main group but still in the open. The stool was covered in red vinyl, and it made a soft, squeaking sound as he sat down. He rested his worn boots on the metal footrest and let out a long, slow breath. For a moment, he just sat there, looking at the reflection in the mirror behind the counter. He saw a tired man in a flannel shirt. He didn't see a celebrity. He didn't see a wealthy actor. He saw someone who looked like they were carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. And in a way, he was. He often thought about life, about loss, and about how fleeting everything could be. Today, those feelings were closer to the surface than usual. He looked around the interior. The walls were painted a soft yellow, and pictures of old Chicago hung in crooked frames. The countertop was a classic checkered pattern, clean but worn smooth by years of plates and elbows. Everything felt grounded. It felt the opposite of the red carpets and flashing lights he was used to. Here, nobody cared about the premieres or the box office numbers. Here, the only thing that mattered was whether the coffee was hot and the eggs were cooked right. Keanu reached into his pocket again and pulled out the small pile of money. He placed it on the counter in front of him, A $5 bill, three $1 bills, and a scattering of quarters and dimes. He stared at it, arranging the coins into neat little stacks. It was a prop, yes, but it was also a test. He wondered how the staff would look at him. Would they see a customer who deserved respect, or would they see a bum who wasn't worth their time? He heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind him. A woman who looked to be in her 50s was walking down the line of the counter. She had graying hair tied back in a loose bun and was wearing a pink uniform that had seen many washes. Her name tag was slightly bent, but he couldn't read the name yet. She held a coffee pot in one hand and a rag in the other. She moved with a kind of practiced efficiency, wiping down the counter as she went, but there was a heaviness to her step. She looked tired, not just physically, but deep down in her soul. As she got closer, Keanu quickly swept the coins back into his hand, leaving just the bills on the counter. He didn't want to seem too obvious, but he wanted the money to be visible. He picked up the laminated menu that was sitting between the sugar shaker and the salt and pepper. He opened it, but he wasn't really reading the words. He was reading the prices. The ceramic mug hit the counter with a dull thud, the dark liquid inside sloshing dangerously close to the rim but not spilling over. A thin wisp of steam curled upward, carrying the bitter, roasted scent of strong coffee. The waitress set it down gently, her movements careful and practiced. She didn't just slide it over. She placed it right in front of him, as if she understood that he needed something stable to hold on to. "Careful, it's fresh," she said, her voice carrying that same motherly warmth that had caught him off guard moments earlier. "Eggs will be up in a jiffy." Keanu nodded, keeping his head low. "Thanks." He watched her walk away toward the kitchen window, her shoes squeaking faintly on the linoleum floor. He wrapped both hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into his cold palms. It was a grounding sensation. In his world, coffee was often handed to him in a paper cup by a personal assistant or served in expensive china on a set. It was fuel, a necessity to keep the engine running. But here, sitting on this scratched stool in a quiet diner holding this heavy mug, it felt different. It felt like a small gift. He took a tentative sip. It was hot, almost too hot, and it tasted slightly burnt, just like diner coffee always does. But to him, right then, it was perfect. It tasted real. Keanu shifted his weight on the stool and turned his attention back to the counter in front of him. This was the part of the experiment he had been dreading. He had to sell the lie. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled wad of bills and the handful of change. He began to smooth out the dollar bills on the counter, his fingers tracing the creases. He lined up the quarters and dimes in a neat row. He started to count under his breath, his voice barely a whisper. 1, 2, 3. He was doing the math, calculating the total cost of the coffee and the eggs against what he had in his hand. He knew exactly how much money he had in his bank account back in reality. Millions, enough to buy this entire diner without blinking. But here, in this role, the stress of not having enough felt surprisingly easy to tap into. Maybe it was because he remembered what it felt like to be a struggling actor years ago, counting coins to buy a loaf of bread. Or maybe it was just the empathy he carried for the millions of people who did this every single day, without it being a performance. As he counted out 3 quarters and a dime, he realized he was making a show of it. He was being too loud with the coins, drawing attention to his poverty. He glanced around nervously to see if anyone was watching. The truckers in the booth were busy with their own conversation, and the elderly couple were still sharing their milkshake. He was safe. But then he heard the soft shuffle of footsteps returning. The waitress was coming back with his plate. Keanu quickly swept the coins into a messy pile, feeling a flush of embarrassment rise up his neck. It was a strange reaction. He wasn't actually broke, but the feeling of being caught counting pennies was visceral. "Here we go," she said cheerfully, sliding the plate in front of him. It was a simple plate. 2 scoops of fluffy yellow scrambled eggs and 2 slices of white toast, butter melting into the bread. There was no garnish, no fancy fruit arrangement on the side, just food. "It looks good," he said honestly. "Best comfort food in the city," she replied with a knowing nod. She pulled a rag from her apron pocket and began to wipe down the counter next to him. "You eat up. Don't worry about rushing. We're not exactly packed today." Keanu picked up his fork. He hesitated for a moment, looking at the food, then looked up at her. She was wiping the same spot on the counter, not because it was dirty, but because she seemed to need a moment to rest. Her eyes had a faraway look in them, a look of someone carrying a heavy mental load. "Rough day?" he asked. The question slipped out before he could stop it. He hadn't meant to break character so much, but the human connection was overpowering the act. She stopped wiping and looked at him, a little surprised that he was speaking. She let out a small, tired sigh and offered a half-smile. "Ain't it always? You know how it goes. Bills to pay, things breaking down. The usual grind." She leaned against the counter slightly, taking the weight off her feet. Keanu noticed then that her uniform shoes were scuffed and worn down at the heel. She looked like she had been standing for 10 hours straight. "I hear you," Keanu said softly. He took a bite of the eggs. They were fluffy and salty, exactly how he liked them. "Sometimes it feels like you're running just to stay in the same place." That got a chuckle out of her. She looked at him with a newfound interest, as if she was surprised to hear such a wise thought come from a man wearing a dirty flannel shirt and counting change. "That's the truth," she said. "Running but not moving, but hey, we're still here, right? Still standing. That counts for something." "It counts for everything," Keanu said. He meant it. He thought about all the times in his life when things had fallen apart, when grief had knocked him down. The only thing that mattered was getting back up, just like she was doing. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes softening. She didn't see a Hollywood star. She saw a kindred spirit, someone else who knew what tired felt like. "You're a good listener," she said quietly. "Most folks just want their coffee and want you to disappear. You actually look at people." "I try," he mumbled, feeling a lump form in his throat. The guilt was twisting in his stomach now. Here was this woman, working hard, being kind to him, thinking he understood her struggle. And he did in a way, but he also had a warm bed and a limitless bank account waiting for him when he walked out that glass door. He felt like a fraud. She reached out and refilled his coffee cup without him asking. "Well, don't you worry about it," she said, her voice brightening up again. "We all have our storms. Just gotta wait for the clouds to clear. You finish your eggs, I'll check on you in a bit." She gave his shoulder a gentle pat, a motherly, reassuring touch, and walked away to check on the truckers. Keanu watched her go. He sat there for a moment, his fork hovering over his plate. The diner felt quiet again, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the low murmur of voices. He looked down at the money still spread out on the counter. The act was working. She treated him with dignity and kindness, not because of who he was, but because of how he acted and the look in his eyes. It was a powerful reminder that people often respond to vulnerability more than they do to power. He took another bite of the toast, the butter rich on his tongue. He chewed slowly, forcing himself to stay in the moment. He looked at his reflection in the mirror behind the counter again. The cap was still low, the scruff still on his face. But the eyes looking back were different now. They weren't just acting. They were filled with a genuine gratitude for this woman, a stranger who had shown him more grace in 5 minutes than he sometimes saw in months of premieres and parties. He knew the hardest part was yet to come. The check. He pushed the thought away and focused on the meal. He wanted to savor this feeling of normalcy, this brief connection, before he had to step back into the reality of who the world thought he was. For now, he was just a man in a diner, sharing a moment of kindness with a tired waitress. And that was enough. The silence in the diner returned, settling back over the room like a heavy blanket. Keanu finished the last bite of his toast, wiping the crumbs from the corner of his mouth with a rough paper napkin. The food had been simple, but it had done its job. He felt a little more grounded, a little more present. But as he sat there, his eyes began to wander again, drawn back to the woman who had treated him with such gentle respect. She was busy now clearing the table where the 2 truckers had been sitting. They had left a mess, crumpled napkins, empty sugar packets, and a syrup stain on the table. She didn't complain. She just worked, scraping the leftovers into a bin and stacking the plates with a rhythmic clatter. Keanu watched her closely. He noticed things he hadn't seen when he first walked in. He saw the way she favored her left leg. Every time she took a step, there was a slight hesitation, a tiny wince that she tried hard to hide. It wasn't a fresh injury. It looked like something that had been bothering her for a long time, a constant ache in her knee or her hip. She moved slowly, carefully, as if her body was made of glass that might shatter if she moved too fast. It was the walk of someone who has been on their feet for decades, working jobs that demanded everything and gave back very little. She turned and headed back toward the kitchen, the stack of plates heavy in her arms. As she passed the counter where Keanu sat, he saw her hands. They were red and rough, the skin dry from the constant washing and the harsh soap used in the kitchen. Her knuckles were swollen. It was clear that her hands worked as hard as the rest of her. Keanu felt a familiar knot tighten in his chest. He had spent his life pretending to be other people, slipping into their skins and feeling their pain, but this was different. This wasn't a script written by a team of writers. This was a real life playing out right in front of him, unscripted and raw. He looked down at his own hands resting on the counter. They were soft, manicured, and protected. The contrast made him feel uncomfortable. He was about to reach for his coffee cup when the phone behind the counter rang. It was an old landline phone with a loud, jarring ring that seemed to cut through the quiet air. The waitress hurried over, balancing the plates in one hand while she grabbed the receiver with the other. "Hello, Maggie's Kitchen," she said, her voice shifting instantly into a professional tone. Keanu took a slow sip of his coffee, trying not to look like he was listening, but the diner was quiet and her voice carried. "Yes, this is she," she said after a moment. Her posture changed. She leaned against the counter, her free hand coming up to rub her temple as if a sudden headache had arrived. There was a long pause. Keanu watched her face through the reflection in the mirror. The polite smile she wore for customers was fading, replaced by a look of deep anxiety. Her eyebrows drew together and her lips pressed into a thin line. I know I'm late," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I told you I was waiting on my paycheck. It got delayed again." Keanu froze. He knew this conversation. He had heard it 1,000 times in movies, but hearing it in real life was heartbreaking. It was the sound of desperation trying to sound polite. "Can I please just have a few more days?" she pleaded. "I can give you half now. No, listen, I need the car to get to work. If you take it, I can't get here, and then I can't pay you at all." "Please," she listened for a long time, her eyes closing tight. Keanu could see her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of the counter. It was a repair shop or a landlord. It didn't matter which. The result was the same. She was dangling by a thread, and the person on the other end of the line was holding the scissors. "Okay," she finally said, her voice cracking slightly. "Okay, Friday, I promise, Friday morning. Thank you for waiting." She slowly hung up the phone. For a second, she didn't move. She just stood there with her head bowed, staring at the scuffed floor. She took a deep, shuddering breath, wiping quickly at her eyes with the back of her hand. Then she straightened her uniform, pasted a tired smile back on her face, and turned around. Keanu looked down at his coffee cup, feeling a wave of guilt wash over him. He felt like an intruder. He had invaded her space, pretended to be poor to see how she would react, and in the process, he had witnessed a private moment of her struggle. It felt cruel. His hand instinctively drifted toward his back pocket. He could feel the outline of his real wallet through the denim. In that wallet was a credit card that could solve her problem instantly. He could pay for the car repairs. He could pay her rent for a year. He could walk out of here and make her life exponentially easier with a single signature. His fingers brushed the leather. He wanted to pull it out. He wanted to say, "I heard that, let me help." But he stopped. He hesitated. If he did that, the spell would break. The moment he revealed who he was, the dynamic would shift. She wouldn't see a customer anymore. She would see a celebrity. She might feel embarrassed that he heard her private call. She might feel like a charity case. The genuine connection they had shared, the simple kindness of giving a hungry man a meal, would be tainted by money. He pulled his hand away from his pocket and clenched his fist on his lap. He reminded himself that this was why he came here. He wanted to see the truth. He wanted to see if people could be kind without the promise of a reward. If he saved the day with his millions, he would never know how this story was supposed to end. He would be buying the ending, not living it. But it was hard. It was incredibly hard to sit there with all the power in the world in his pocket and do nothing. The waitress came back over to him, her stride a little slower than before. She didn't look at him with sadness, though. She looked at him with that same steady, calm gaze. She had no idea that he knew her secret. To her, he was just a man in a flannel shirt, almost done with his coffee. "All done there, hun?" she asked, glancing at his empty plate. "Yeah," Keanu said, his voice feeling a little rough. "It was perfect, thank you." "Glad you liked it," she said, reaching for the plate. "Can I get you a refill to go, or are you all set?" "I'm all set," he said. As she cleared the plate, Keanu looked at the small pile of money on the counter, the crumpled bills and the coins. It looked so pathetic compared to the burden she was carrying. He felt a sudden, intense urge to sweep it all into the trash and give her everything he had. But he stayed still. He had committed to this. He had to see it through. He watched her walk away again, the slight limp in her step more obvious now that he knew she was fighting to keep her car and likely her home. She was fighting a battle just to survive, yet she had taken the time to make sure he felt welcomed. She had given him warmth when she was cold inside. Keanu took a deep breath and prepared himself for the next moment. The bill was coming. The test was about to reach its peak. He was about to find out just how deep her kindness went. The little black check folder landed on the counter with a soft, almost silent thud. It was placed right next to his empty coffee cup. The waitress didn't say anything this time. She just gave him a quick nod and moved away to wipe down a nearby table. Keanu stared at the folder. It was a cheap vinyl thing, peeling slightly at the corners. In the real world, in his actual life, he didn't even look at checks. He just handed over a card or signed a slip and walked away. But today, this small piece of paper felt like the most important document in the world. He took a slow breath, centering himself. He needed to stay in character. He needed to be the man who had nothing left. He reached out and flipped the folder open. Inside, handwritten in blue ink, was the total: coffee, $2, eggs and toast, $6.50. Total $8.50. Keanu looked down at the pile of money on the counter. He had already arranged it earlier. He had 3 crumpled $1 bills, a $5 bill, and a small scatter of coins. He pushed the $5 bill and the 3 ones together. That made $8. Then he pulled the coins closer, 2 quarters and a dime. That made 50 cents. He stared at the money. It was exactly enough, not a penny more. In a movie, this is where the sad music would swell. The camera would zoom in on the actor's face to show the shame, but in real life there was no music. There was just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of a car driving past outside. Keanu felt a genuine tightness in his chest. He wasn't just acting anymore. The situation felt real. He thought about the phone call he had overheard, the worry in her voice about her car, the desperation to keep her job. And here he was about to pay the exact change, leaving her absolutely nothing for her hard work. It felt wrong. It felt cruel, but he had to see it through. He had to know if her kindness had a limit. He began to stack the money, his fingers moving slowly. He placed the bills on top of the check folder. Then he carefully stacked the quarters and the dime on top of the bills. It was a messy little tower of paper and metal. It looked pathetic sitting there on the clean counter. He pushed his chair back, the metal legs screeching loudly against the floor. The sound made him wince. He stood up, smoothing down his flannel shirt. He felt small. He felt the weight of the lie pressing down on him. The waitress heard the noise and turned around. She saw him standing and walked over, wiping her hands on her apron. She reached for the folder, expecting to just scoop it up and move on. "Wait," Keanu said. His voice came out rough, like he hadn't spoken in days. She paused, her hand hovering over the counter. She looked at him, waiting. Keanu looked at the money, then up at her eyes. He forced himself to look embarrassed. He forced his shoulders to slump forward. I counted it out," he stammered. "It's all there, it's exactly $8.50. He gestured helplessly at the pile of coins. "I'm sorry," he added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That's all I have right now. I don't have anything left for a tip." The words hung in the air between them. Keanu held his breath. This was the test. In a city like Chicago, in a busy diner, people were often in a rush. Waitresses relied on tips to live. He had just given her a grand total of 0 gratitude in the form of money. He braced himself for a sigh, for a roll of the eyes, or for a cold, polite, "That's okay," that actually meant "you're cheap." But none of that happened. The waitress looked down at the money. She saw the worn bills. She saw the coins. Then she looked back at his face. She didn't look at the register. She didn't do the math to see if he was lying. She just looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the tiredness in his eyes, the way his shoulders were slumped, the worn-out clothes. A softness washed over her face that Keanu hadn't expected. It wasn't pity. It was understanding. It was the look of someone who had been down on their luck before and recognized the signs in someone else. "Give me that," she said gently. She reached out, but she didn't take the money. Instead, she used 2 fingers to slide the entire stack of bills and coins back toward him. She pushed it across the Formica counter until it was right in front of his chest. Keanu blinked, confused. "What? No, I owe you." "SHH," she interrupted, not unkindly. She shook her head slightly, a small smile playing on her lips. "You keep it." "I can't do that," Keanu said, his voice cracking slightly. He pushed the money back toward her. "I ate the food." "I have to pay." "You listen to me," she said, leaning in a little closer over the counter. Her voice was low and firm, but filled with warmth. "I've been watching you since you walked in here. You didn't ask for anything special. You were polite. You said thank you, and you look like a man who is carrying a very heavy load right now." She tapped the counter gently with her finger. "We've all been there. We've all had those weeks where the world feels like it's closing in. You don't need to worry about the bill today. Consider it a gift. Just promise me one thing." Keanu stood frozen, his hand hovering over the money. He felt a lump form in his throat so big he could barely swallow. The act was falling apart. The gratitude he felt was overwhelming. "What?" he managed to squeak out. "Promise me you'll get a good meal tomorrow, okay?" she said softly. "And maybe things will look a little brighter in the morning." Before Keanu could argue, before he could try to force the cash into her hand, she reached over and picked up his empty coffee cup. She gave him a final nod, a signal that the conversation was over, and turned away to drop the cup into the bin. Keanu stood there by the stool, completely stunned. He looked down at the money on the counter. It was still sitting there, the bills crumpled, the coins shiny. He looked at her back as she walked toward the kitchen. She was limping again, but her steps seemed a little lighter. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a mixture of shame and profound awe. He had come here to test her humanity, to see if she would be kind to a nobody. But she had shown him something more. She had shown him that kindness wasn't about money. It wasn't a transaction. It was a bridge. She had seen him struggling, even though his struggle was a lie, and she had reached out to pull him up, asking for nothing in return. He had millions of dollars in the bank, but in that moment, he felt like the poorest man in the room because he knew he would never have the kind of grace she just showed. She had given him the most valuable thing she had, her compassion, when she thought he had nothing to give back. He quickly realized he couldn't just leave the money there. If he did, she might be insulted, or she might just put it in the tip jar for the cook. He had to do something else. He had to pay her back in a way that respected her dignity, but also acknowledged her incredible heart. With shaking hands, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his real leather wallet. It felt heavy and substantial compared to the coins on the counter. He flipped it open and looked inside. He saw the hundreds, the credit cards. The contrast made him dizzy. He looked up to make sure she wasn't watching. She was busy talking to the cook through the window. This was his chance. He wasn't going to just walk away. He was going to leave her something that would actually help, but he had to be careful. He had to do it right. He took a deep breath, his mind racing, planning the final move of this unexpected, life-changing game. The air in the diner seemed to stand still as Keanu stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked down at the crumpled bills and coins the waitress had pushed back to him. She had told him to keep it. She had basically told him that his dignity was worth more than $8.50. He felt a lump in his throat that he couldn't swallow away. He knew he couldn't walk out of here and take her money, even though she had offered it as a gift. That wasn't right. With a trembling hand, he quickly scooped up the pile of change and the small bills. He shoved them deep into his front pocket, the metal clinking softly against his leg. Now the counter in front of him was empty, save for his empty coffee cup and the small black check folder which he had left closed. He looked around the diner again. The truckers were gone now. The elderly couple had paid and were slowly making their way toward the glass door. The kitchen was quiet. The waitress had her back turned, busy wiping down the counter near the register. She was humming a low tune, something that sounded sad but hopeful. This was his moment. Keanu reached into his back pocket and pulled out his real wallet. It was made of fine black leather, smooth and cool to the touch. It felt heavy in his hand, weighted down by the cards and cash inside. He felt a strange mix of emotions, guilt for the deception, but an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the connection they had shared. He flipped the wallet open and thumbed through the bills. He pulled out $100 bill, then another, then another. He hesitated, thinking about the phone call he had overheard, the stress in her voice about the car and the rent. He took out two more bills, $500. It was a drop in the bucket for him, but he knew for her it was a lifeline. It was a repaired car. It was a month of groceries. It was a good night's sleep without worrying about the lights being turned off. He looked at the crisp, green bills. They looked stark and out of place on the worn, chipped counter. He needed to hide them to make sure they were a surprise and not a scene. He looked around for something to cover them. He saw a stack of paper napkins near the sugar shaker. He pulled one out. He needed to write something, not a signature, not "Thanks, Keanu Reeves." That would ruin everything. It would turn a moment of human connection into a celebrity stunt. He wanted her to know that the money came from a place of deep appreciation for who she was as a person, not for who he was. He grabbed a pen from the counter and leaned over the napkin. He thought for a second, the tip of the pen hovering over the paper. He wanted to tell her that she was seen, that her kindness mattered, that the world was better because she was in it. He wrote in block letters to keep the handwriting unfamiliar. "Your kindness is more valuable than you know. Thank you for making a stranger feel seen. Keep the change." He read it over. It was simple. It was honest. He carefully folded the napkin in half, hiding the money inside. Then he placed the folded napkin right on top of the closed check folder. He pressed it down flat so it wouldn't blow away when the door opened. He took one last look at the spot. It just looked like a napkin left behind. He straightened his cap, pulling the brim low again. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the scent of coffee and bacon one last time. He felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had come here looking for normalcy, and he had found something much better. He had found grace. "Hey," he said softly. The waitress turned around, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at him, expecting him to argue about the bill again. Instead, he just gave her a small nod. "Thanks for the meal," he said. "It was the best I've had in a long time." "You're welcome, honey," she replied, her smile warm and genuine. "Take care of yourself, okay?" "I will," he said. "You take care, too." He turned and walked toward the exit. His boots squeaked on the floor, a rhythmic sound that marked his departure. He reached for the glass handle of the door. The sun was shining brightly outside, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He pushed the door open, the little bell jingling cheerfully above him, a signal of an ending. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the heat of the afternoon wrapped around him. He didn't look back immediately. He just walked a few steps away from the building, blending into the flow of the city. He felt lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted off his shoulders. The act was over, but the feeling remained. Inside the diner, the silence returned. The waitress watched him walk away through the glass window. She saw him merge into the crowd of people on the street, becoming just another face in the city. She shook her head slightly, a sad smile on her lips. She hoped he would be okay. She hoped tomorrow would be kinder to him. She walked over to the counter to clear his spot. She reached for the coffee cup first. Then she saw the folded napkin sitting on the check folder. "Huh," she muttered to herself. She assumed he had left a note or maybe just trash. She picked it up, intending to throw it away. But the napkin felt heavy, thick. She frowned. She unfolded it. The bills fluttered out, crisp and bright green against the white paper. Her eyes went wide. She stared at them, not quite understanding what she was seeing. 1, 2, 3, 4 $500 bills. $500. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at the door, then back at the money. It couldn't be real. It had to be a mistake. But there, written in bold black letters on the napkin, was the message. "Your kindness is more valuable than you know." She read the words twice. Her hands began to tremble, just like they had when she was on the phone earlier, but for a very different reason this time. The tears that she had been holding back all day finally spilled over, sliding down her cheeks. She looked out the window again, scanning the street for the man in the flannel shirt. He was gone. He had vanished into the city, but the weight in her hand was real. The relief was real. She clutched the napkin and the money to her chest, right over her heart. She thought about his quiet voice, his polite manners, and the way he had looked at her not as a servant, but as a human being. She realized then that she hadn't just been serving a customer. She had been entertaining an angel in disguise. On the sidewalk a block away, Keanu Reeves took off his cap and ran a hand through his hair. He hailed a passing cab. As he climbed in, he didn't feel like a movie star. He didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like a man who had been given a gift far greater than money. He had been reminded that in a world that often feels cold and divided, kindness was still the most valuable currency of all. He leaned back against the seat, closed his eyes, and whispered a thank you to the woman who had given him a free breakfast and a priceless lesson. He was calculating what he could afford. "What can I get for you, honey?" a voice asked. It was gentle but tired. Keanu looked up. The waitress was standing in front of him, her eyes meeting his. She didn't look at him with awe. She didn't do a double take. She didn't whisper to her coworker. She just looked at him with a polite, patient expression, waiting for his order. To her, he was just another guy stopping in for lunch. That was exactly what he wanted, but it also made his heart ache a little. The invisibility he craved was now his reality, and it felt lonelier than he expected. He cleared his throat, lowering his voice to a rough mumble. Just a coffee, please, Black. And what's the cheapest thing you have to eat?" He watched her face closely, looking for a sign of judgment. Would she roll her eyes? Would she sigh in annoyance? Instead, her expression softened. She didn't look at him like he was bothering her. She looked at him with something that looked like concern. "Well, the toast is cheap," she said softly. "But if you're hungry, the scrambled eggs with toast is only a couple of bucks more, and it'll fill you up better. You look like you could use a good meal." Keanu felt a tightness in his chest. He nodded slowly, keeping his eyes on the menu. "Okay, the eggs and toast then." "Thanks," she jotted it down on her notepad. "Coming right up." She turned to pour the coffee, and as she did, Keanu looked back down at his small pile of money. He pushed the crumpled bills forward slightly, his heart beating a little faster. The act had begun. He was no longer Keanu, the movie star. He was just a man with an empty pocket and a heavy heart, waiting to see if kindness still existed in a world that often felt too busy to care. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves, and prepared himself for the interaction that would follow.